The Arctic night was an unrelenting force, pressing against the wooden walls of the isolated cabin, whispering through the cracks with the kind of cold that could freeze a man's breath midair. Daniel Whitaker sat by the fire, his knife scraping against a block of wood as he carved absent-mindedly. He wasn't making anything in particular, just keeping his hands busy, keeping his mind from slipping into old memories. Life out here was simple. Wake up, hunt, eat, survive. That's all he wanted. That's all he thought he needed. But then a sound came, faint, almost lost in the howling wind. A whimper. Daniel frowned, setting down the knife. No animal cried out like that unless it was in trouble, and trouble was something he couldn't afford to ignore. Pulling on his heavy coat, he grabbed the rifle from beside the door, a habit he never questioned, and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a fist, the kind of cold that turned flesh brittle, that sank into your bones and never left. He adjusted his scarf, scanning the darkness. Then he saw it, a small lump in the snow, barely visible against the pale landscape. It shivered violently, tiny whimpers escaping its throat. A bear cub, alone. Daniel stiffened. A cub never strayed far from its mother. And if its mother was nearby? His breath hung in the air as he scanned the tree line, every instinct telling him to back away. But there was nothing. No sound of heavy footfalls, no deep, warning growl, just silence. The cub lifted its head, black eyes locking onto his, pleading, "Damn it." Daniel crouched, hesitating only for a moment, before scooping the tiny creature into his arms. Its fur was stiff with ice, its body alarmingly light. It was dying. The fire crackled, throwing long shadows across the log walls as Daniel wrapped the cub in an old wool blanket. Its body barely moved, save for the slow, weak rise and fall of its breath. Daniel rubbed its tiny paws, trying to coax warmth back into them. He wasn't sure why he cared, maybe because he knew what it felt like to be left alone in the cold. He shook the thought away. The cub's body trembled beneath his hands. It was starving, dehydrated. It needed something. But what did you feed a half-frozen bear cub? After a moment of hesitation, he reached for the emergency food rations he kept for the worst winters. Goat's milk powder. It wasn't much, but it was something. Using an old cloth, he trickled warm milk into the cub's mouth. It didn't resist, too weak to move, but after a few drops, its tongue flicked out, taking in more. That was a good sign. As the storm raged outside, Daniel sat back, watching the small creature fight for life. He wasn't sure why, but he found himself speaking. "Where's your mother, huh?" His voice was rough from months of silence. "Why'd you end up on my porch?" The cub didn't answer, but he needed to, because Daniel needed to know. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the land covered in a fresh layer of untouched snow. The cub was still alive, breathing a little stronger than the night before. But Daniel knew this wasn't over. Strapping on his snowshoes, he followed the cub's tiny tracks into the wilderness, his rifle slung over his back. The sky was a dull gray, the air thick with the promise of another storm. The tracks wove through the trees, faint but still visible. The further he went, the more uneasy he became. There were no other bear tracks, no sign of a mother. Then he saw it, a shape in the snow. His breath caught as he approached. The mother bear lay motionless, half buried by the storm, her fur stiff with frost. Dead. Daniel swallowed hard, his eyes scanning the body. Deep gashes marred her sides. Claw marks, deep and deliberate. Another bear had done this, a bigger one. His stomach twisted as he looked down at the cub's tiny prints leading away from the scene. It had run, alone, through the storm. Somehow it had made it to his cabin. Daniel exhaled, his breath thick in the frigid air. If he left it alone, it wouldn't last a week, maybe not even a day. Days passed. The cub, Tundra, as Daniel began calling it, grew stronger. At first it barely moved, too weak to do more than curl up by the fire. But after a few days of careful feeding, it started toddling after him, its tiny paws slipping on the wooden floor. Daniel wasn't sure when it happened, but the silence of his cabin felt different, less empty. He found himself talking more. about hunting, about the weather, about things he hadn't spoken of in years, about his wife. He hadn't said her name in so long, he almost forgot how it felt on his tongue. Emily. She would have laughed at him, bringing a bear cub into their home, said he was crazy. Maybe she would have been right. But as Tundra nuzzled against his leg, seeking warmth, Daniel knew one thing. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone. Weeks turned to months. Tundra grew stronger, faster. His once clumsy steps turned into powerful strides, his fur thick and gleaming. Daniel knew this wouldn't last. A bear wasn't meant to live in a cabin, and as much as he wanted to keep Tundra safe, he couldn't, because Tundra wasn't his. The sun was rising, casting long golden streaks across the snow as Daniel stood at the edge of the forest. Tundra sniffed the air, his instincts awakening. The wild was calling. Daniel knelt beside him, resting a hand against the thick fur. "You'll be all right," he murmured. "You were born for this." Tundra hesitated. Then with one final glance, he turned and disappeared into the trees. Daniel stood there for a long time, the wind whispering around him. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel quite so alone. Because somewhere out there, in the vast Arctic wilderness, a bear named Tundra still carried a piece of him forward.